The silence in the penthouse was absolute, shattered only by the hollow thud of an empty safe door swinging on its hinges. The $10 million in untraceable bonds were gone, replaced by a lingering scent of Nyasha's jasmine perfume and a discarded silk robe that pooled like a ghost on the marble floor. Nyasha Okari, the woman Seo Jae-Hyun had elevated from the shadows and promised a future of unyielding status, had vanished into the night. She saw only the freedom she had stolen, the chance to run back to her first love, Tendai, with a king's ransom in her luggage. She had no idea that the wealth she clutched in her trembling hands was already turning to ash. She saw the money as her salvation, unaware that Jae-Hyun had already made a single phone call to blacklist every serial number and freeze every shadow account she possessed. Most dangerously, she had no idea that while she was boarding a flight to be with Tendai, Jae-Hyun was sitting in his darkened study, his face a mask of cold clarity. As Han Soo-min stepped into the room to confirm that Nyasha had just landed in Tendai's arms, the first flicker of the slow burn began. Nyasha hadn't just run away with a fortune, she had declared war on a man who was 12 hours away from making her realize that without his loyalty, her freedom was nothing more than a funeral. The story of Jae-Hyun and Nyasha is one of sacred loyalty meeting the ultimate, calculated betrayal. Long before the heist, Nyasha had been a woman caught between two worlds, the comfortable, dangerous luxury offered by Jae-Hyun and the impulsive, emotional pull of her past with Tendai. Jae-Hyun, the strategic head of a shadow empire, rules through a code of absolute trust, treating his word as law and his fiancée as his one vulnerability. Despite his terrifying reputation across the underworld, he treated Nyasha with a sophisticated gentleness, offering her a status and security she had never known. He spoiled her with a future built on his own strength, yet Nyasha remained conflicted, secretly clinging to the memories of a man who had nothing but promised everything. On this fateful night, her decision to flee with his fortune would turn his devotion into a chilling reckoning. As Jae-Hyun watched the surveillance footage of his empty halls, he knew that the ghosts of Nyasha's past hadn't just returned, they had stolen his trust, and now he would let the weight of that stolen gold crush them both. The heavy, floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains of the master suite swayed in the soft draft of the air conditioning, but the room itself felt frozen. Seo Jae-Hyun stood by the open-wall safe, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the white marble floor. He didn't pace, and he didn't roar. He simply stood there, his hands loosely at his sides, staring into the dark, rectangular void where $10 million in untraceable bonds had rested only hours before. On the floor nearby lay a discarded silk robe, its fabric wrinkled as if it had been shed in a desperate hurry, and a faint, mocking scent of jasmine lingered in the air, the perfume he had bought her for their anniversary. Han Soo-min stood in the doorway, her presence as unobtrusive as a ghost's. She had served Jae-Hyun for a decade, watching him dismantle rival syndicates and negotiate peace treaties that saved thousands of lives, but she had never seen him this still. It was the stillness of a predator that had just realized the trap was empty, or perhaps, the stillness of a man who was recalibrating his entire reality. The security feed for the back entrance was looped for exactly 12 minutes between 2 a.m. and 2:12 a.m., Soo-min reported, her voice a low, neutral hum. A private car was waiting 3 blocks away. She didn't use any of the household vehicles. She was thorough, Jae-Hyun. Jae-Hyun finally moved, but only to reach out and touch the edge of the safe. His fingers traced the cold steel with a devastating gentleness. Thorough, he repeated, the word sounding like a shard of ice. I taught her to be thorough. I gave her the keys to the house, and she used them to lock me out of her life. Should I activate the recovery teams? Soo-min asked, her hand moving toward her comms unit. The flight manifests are already being screened. We can have her intercepted before she clears customs in Harare. Jae-Hyun turned then, and the light from the hallway caught the cold clarity in his eyes. There was no rage there, rage was a messy, impulsive emotion that led to mistakes. Instead, there was a terrifying, crystalline resolve. No, he said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Sumin's arm stand up. Let her go to him. Let her feel the weight of that paper in her hands. She thinks she stole my fortune, Sumin. She doesn't realize she only stole a tether. He walked toward the window, looking out over the flickering lights of Seoul. Nyasha believes that money buys freedom. I want her to learn that without my protection, that money is nothing but a target on her back. Don't send the guns. Send the ghosts. I want to watch her realize exactly what Tendai Mbeki is worth when the gold starts to burn. The humid, salt-thick air of the tropical night felt like a heavy blanket as Nyasha stepped out of the arrivals terminal, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of her carry-on. She had spent the 12-hour flight staring at the luggage that contained Jae-Hyun's fortune, her heart hammering against her ribs with every pocket of turbulence. But as she scanned the crowd and locked eyes with Tendai Mbeki, the terror that had shadowed her since Seoul began to dissolve into a frantic, desperate relief. Tendai looked exactly as he did in her memories, vibrant, impulsive, and wearing a smile that promised the world. When he pulled her into his arms, the scent of expensive cologne and sea salt replaced the sterile jasmine of the penthouse. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she had actually done it. She had escaped the glacier, outsmarted the Shadow Empire, and bought her way back to the only man she had ever truly loved. You did it, Nyash, Tendai whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an excitement that made her feel invincible. I have the car waiting. We have a villa on the coast under a false name. No more hiding in shadows, no more rules. Just us and the future you brought with you. They drove along the coastline, the moonlight dancing on the dark waves of the Indian Ocean. In the back seat sat the bag of bonds, $10 million that Nyasha viewed as the price of her soul's ransom. She watched Tendai through the rearview mirror. He was talking animatedly about the businesses they would start and the places they would visit. He seemed so untroubled, so light, a stark contrast to the heavy, calculating silence of Seo Jae-Hyun. As they reached the villa, a sprawling white stone sanctuary tucked away from the main road, Tendai popped a bottle of vintage champagne. The golden liquid bubbled in crystal flutes, and for an hour, they danced in the living room to the sound of the surf. Nyasha felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't known in years. She was no longer a mafia boss's property, she was a woman with a fortune and a lover. To us, Tendai toasted, clinking his glass against hers. To the smartest woman I know. Nyasha smiled, sipping the wine, but as she looked out at the dark tree-line surrounding the villa, a shiver traced its way down her spine. The freedom felt absolute, yet in the back of her mind, she kept seeing Jae-Hyun's calm, unblinking eyes. She didn't know that miles away, in a darkened security hub, a single red light had just blinked on a map, marking their exact coordinates. She didn't know that the fortune in her bag was currently being flagged by every major clearinghouse on the continent. In the quiet of the tropical night, the first taste of freedom was sweet, but the aftertaste of the slow burn was already beginning to settle on her tongue. The morning sun filtered through the palm fronds, casting long, barred shadows across the villa's breakfast nook that looked uncomfortably like a cage. Nyasha sat at the glass table, her laptop open, the stack of bearer bonds resting beside her coffee like a silent, golden deity. These were the keys to her new kingdom, untraceable, liquid, and absolute. Tendai was in the kitchen, whistling as he fried plantains, already speaking of a yacht he had seen for sale in the harbor. I'm going to transfer the first $500,000 to the offshore account we set up, Nyasha said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. She began to input the serial numbers from the top 3 bonds into the secure portal Jae-Hyun had once taught her to use. She clicked the execute button, expecting the familiar green checkmark of a successful validation. Instead, the screen turned a stark, clinical red. Error, asset flagged. Contact issuing institution. A cold prickle of sweat broke out at the nape of her neck. She refreshed the page, her heart thudding a jagged rhythm against her ribs. She tried a different bond, one from the bottom of the stack, carefully typing the alphanumeric code. Again, the screen flashed crimson. Status, voided. Report to compliance. Tendai, she whispered, her voice failing her. What's up, babe? Planning the honeymoon already? He asked, leaning against the doorframe with a spatula in hand. His smile faltered when he saw the pallor of her face. They aren't working, she gasped, her breath coming in shallow hitches. They're untraceable, Tendai. Jae-Hyun said these were as good as cash anywhere in the world. But the system is rejecting them. It's like they've been erased from existence. She tried a third, then a fourth, her movements becoming frantic, her fingers blurring over the keyboard. Every single bond returned the same result. The $10 million was there, physically sitting in front of her, the paper heavy and the ink intricate, but in the digital world where power truly resided, it had become worthless scrap. Try the secondary broker in the city, Tendai suggested, his impulsive excitement curdling into a sharp, defensive edge. Maybe the online portal is just glitching. Jae-Hyun couldn't have known this fast, Nyasha. You were careful. But as Nyasha looked at the stack of paper, she remembered the way Jae-Hyun used to look at his watch, with the calm patience of a man who knew exactly when the tide would turn. He hadn't chased her because he didn't need to. He had simply reached out and turned off the world she thought she had stolen. The slow burn had moved from his heart to her pockets, and as Tendai's eyes narrowed with a sudden, flickering doubt, Nyasha realized that without the money, the man standing in the kitchen was looking at her differently. The first crack hadn't just appeared in her fortune, it had appeared in her sanctuary. The humid air inside the villa, once smelling of paradise, now felt stagnant and heavy. Nyasha sat on the edge of the unmade bed, watching Tendai pace the length of the room like a caged animal. The charm that had once enthralled her, the impulsive, fiery energy she had missed in the cold halls of Seoul, now felt like a jagged blade. He wasn't the pillar she had imagined, he was a storm of nerves, his face flushed with a frustration that bordered on accusation. How can they be voided, Nyasha? You said you knew the system. Tendai snapped, his voice rising to a pitch that made her flinch. He kicked a footstool, the loud thud echoing through the quiet house. We have 3 months of rent due on this place in advance. If that paper is just paper, we're dead in the water. I told you, Jae-Hyun he's different, Nyasha whispered, clutching her elbows. He doesn't fight with his fists. He moves the world around you until you have nowhere to stand. The reality of Tendai was beginning to grate against the polished memory she had carried for years. In her mind, he was the brave rebel who would protect her. In reality, he was a man who hadn't even checked if the perimeter was secure. He was all impulse and no strategy. When she tried to suggest they lay low, he insisted they drive to the city to find a black market money changer, his desperation clouding his judgment. It was during that drive that the eyes became undeniable. As they wound through the coastal curves, Nyasha noticed the silver sedan. It didn't try to overtake them. It didn't flash its lights or draw a weapon. It simply sat 3 car lengths behind, a silent, metallic shadow. When they pulled into a crowded marketplace, the car parked across the street. When they walked into a cafe, a man in a linen suit sat at the corner table, never looking at them, yet never leaving. They're going to jump us, Tendai hissed, his hand shaking as he reached for his phone. I should have brought a piece. Why aren't they doing anything? Because they don't have to, Nyasha realized, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. Jae-Hyun wasn't sending hands to snatch her back. He was sending eyes to ensure she knew she was never alone. He was letting her see the cracks in Tendai's bravado, letting her watch her first love crumble under the pressure of a threat he couldn't see or touch. Every time Tendai checked the rearview mirror with wide, panicked eyes, or snapped at her for breathing too loudly, Nyasha felt the distance between them grow. She had run toward a memory, only to find that reality was a much smaller, weaker man. Han Soo-min sat in the back of a nondescript transit van, the cool blue glow of 3 monitors illuminating her impassive face. On the central screen, a long-range thermal feed captured the interior of the villa. 2 glowing heat signatures moved erratically, one was pacing, its jagged movement signaling a spiraling temper, while the other remained curled in a tight, defensive ball on the sofa. To the world, Soo-min was a ghost, but to Seo Jae-Hyun, she was the cold, objective lens through which he viewed the dismantling of a lie. She tapped a key, opening a secure, encrypted audio channel to Seoul. The connection hissed for a second before the heavy, rhythmic silence of Jae-Hyun's presence filled her earpiece. "Report," he said. His voice was as steady as a heartbeat in sleep, devoid of the jagged edges of betrayal. "The fracture is widening, Jae-Hyun," Soo-min replied, her eyes fixed on the screen where Tendai was now gesturing wildly with a bottle in his hand. Becky's impulsivity has transitioned into verbal aggression. He spent the last hour blaming her for the dead paper in their safe. He isn't looking at her as a partner anymore, he's looking at her as a failed investment. And Nyasha? Soo-min watched as the heat signature on the sofa moved slightly, a hand reaching up to wipe at a face that was likely stained with tears. She is beginning to recognize the silhouette of her mistake. She spent the afternoon staring at the road, watching our scout cars. She isn't afraid of us anymore, she's afraid of being alone with him. In the background of the villa's audio feed, a glass shattered. The sound was sharp, followed by Tendai's voice echoing through the open floor plan, shouting about the worthless risks he had taken. Soo-min didn't flinch. She had seen this play out 100 times in the underworld. When the gold disappears, the masks fall away. The ex-lover is emotional, predictable, and weak, Soo-min continued, her voice clinical. He has already contacted a local low-level fixer to see if he can sell the location of the bonds for a finder's fee. He's looking for an exit strategy that doesn't include her. "Let him search," Jae-Hyun murmured. The sound of a page turning came through the line. He was likely reading a ledger, unbothered by the chaos he was orchestrating from thousands of miles away. "I want her to see him for exactly what he is. I want her to realize that the freedom he offered was just a different kind of debt. Continue the observation. Do not intervene. Let the silence do the work." Soo-min disconnected the call and leaned back. Through the van's reinforced window, she saw the lights of the villa flicker. Inside, a woman was realizing that her first love was a house of cards, and the wind was only just beginning to blow. The digital world did not scream when it died, it simply flickered and went dark. Nyasha sat in the dim light of the villa's terrace, her phone screen casting a pale, sickly light onto her face. She had tried to log into her banking app for the 10th time that hour, only to be met with a message that felt like a tombstone, "Account not found." It wasn't just the money she had stolen that was gone, it was everything. She tried her social media, seeking a familiar face, a connection to the world she once knew, but her profile had vanished as if it had never been indexed. Her email addresses returned invalid errors. Even her cloud storage, containing the only photos of her family and her childhood, had been purged. Seo Jae-Hyun was a man of absolute geometry, and he was currently erasing every coordinate of her existence. To the global network, Nyasha Okuri no longer existed. "We need to leave this place," Tendai muttered, pacing behind her with a frantic, jagged energy. "I found a hotel in the next province that takes cash under the table. Pack the bags." But when they reached the rental car agency to swap their flagged vehicle, the clerk looked at Nyasha's passport and then back at his monitor with a frown. He swiped her card, a secondary account Jae-Hyun had let her keep, and the machine emitted a long, shrill tone of rejection. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the clerk said, his voice dropping into a suspicious, rehearsed politeness. "This passport number is flagged as deceased or invalid in the international registry. I cannot process this transaction. In fact, the system is requiring me to notify local authorities." The blood drained from Nyasha's face. She wasn't being hunted by assassins, she was being buried alive in the light of day. She was a ghost, a woman without a name, a country, or a credit score. Without Jae-Hyun's shadow to give her form, she was evaporating. They fled the agency before the police could arrive, huddling in a cramped, humid bus station where the air smelled of exhaust and desperation. Tendai sat 2 benches away, his eyes darting toward the security cameras, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't offer to hold her hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He looked at her not as his first love, but as a dangerous contagion. "You're a liability, Nyasha," he whispered, the words hitting her harder than any physical blow. "He's erased you. If I stay with you, he'll erase me too." Nyasha looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the station. She saw a woman who had traded a fortress for a ruin. Jae-Hyun hadn't taken her life, he had taken her identity, leaving her with a man who was already looking for the nearest exit. The social death was complete, and as the bus pulled into the station, Nyasha realized that being a ghost was far more terrifying than being a prisoner. Of the cheap motel they had retreated to felt like they were closing in, sweating with the humidity of the coast and the stench of rotting fruit. Inside the cramped room, the air was thick with a new, sharper kind of poison, suspicion. Nyasha sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, her eyes fixed on the bag of voided bonds. They were no longer a promise of a new life, they were a pile of cursed paper that had stripped the mask off the man she thought she loved. Tendai stood by the window, peeking through the cracked blinds. His movements were twitchy, his skin sallow from lack of sleep. He turned to her, and for the first time, Nyasha saw genuine malice in his eyes. "You're lying to me," he spat, his voice a low, jagged hiss. "There's no way you only took the bonds. A man like Jae-Hyun. You lived with him for years. You know where the real accounts are. You have a cold wallet hidden somewhere, don't you? Or a private key?" "I told you, Tendai, I took everything I could reach," Nyasha whispered, her voice trembling. "There is nothing else. He's frozen us out. Can't you see that? Don't play the victim with me." Tendai roared, crossing the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her travel bag, dumping its contents onto the floor. Silk dresses and expensive toiletries, remnants of her life as a queen, scattered like debris. He began ripping the linings of her suitcases, his fingers frantic and claw-like. "You're holding out. You're waiting for me to leave so you can live like a local princess while I rot in a cell for helping you." Nyasha watched him, her heart turning to lead. This was the man she had romanticized in the cold luxury of Seoul. This was the pure love she had traded Jae-Hyun's devotion for. Tendai wasn't looking for a life with her, he was looking for a payout, and now that the payout had vanished, he was becoming the very monster he claimed Jae-Hyun was. He was right, she murmured, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Jae-Hyun didn't have to do anything. He just had to let me see who you really are. Tendai spun around, a manic glint in his eyes. "What did you say? You're still thinking about him? You're master." He grabbed her chin, his grip bruising and desperate. "If I don't find more money by morning, Nyasha, I'm gone. And I'm not leaving empty-handed. Maybe the local syndicates will pay for the location of a ghost with a price on her head." The domestic nightmare was complete. The dream life had dissolved into a squalid room where the man she loved was now her most dangerous predator. As Tendai returned to his frantic searching, Nyasha leaned her head against the damp wall, finally understanding the true cruelty of Jae-Hyun's silence. He hadn't just taken her money, he had allowed her to be destroyed by the very thing she thought would save her. The morning air in the motel was stagnant, vibrating with the low, rhythmic hum of a failing ceiling fan. Nyasha woke to the sound of a heavy thud against the wooden door. Tendai, who had fallen into a fitful sleep on the floor clutching a kitchen knife, scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Stay back," he hissed at Nyasha, as if she were the source of the threat. He approached the door with a jagged, uncoordinated caution, his hand trembling as he turned the deadbolt. There was no assassin waiting in the hallway. There was only a small, square box wrapped in charcoal gray paper, sitting precisely in the center of the threshold. It was a stark, elegant intrusion into their squalid reality. Tendai snatched it up, his greed momentarily overriding his terror. Is it jewelry? Did he send a peace offering? He tore the paper open, but as the lid came off, his face contorted in confusion. Nyasha stood up, her legs feeling like water. She knew that gray paper. It was the color of the stationery Jae-Hyun used for his most private correspondences. Tendai dumped the contents onto the scarred bedside table. A fine, glittering pile of gray-white powder spilled out, shimmering like diamonds under the harsh fluorescent light. Amidst the dust lay a distorted, mangled piece of platinum, the band of her engagement ring. The 3-carat diamond that had once sat atop it was gone, pulverized into the very dust that now coated Tendai's frantic fingers. Nyasha felt the breath leave her lungs. The ring hadn't just been broken, it had been systematically destroyed with the same industrial precision Jae-Hyun applied to his enemies. It was a message written in the language of cold clarity. It's just dirt, Tendai stammered, rubbing the powder between his thumb and forefinger, his voice cracking with a high, hysterical edge. He sent us dirt. The man is a psycho. It's not dirt, Tendai, Nyasha whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. That was my ring. He didn't just take the money back. He's showing us that everything he gave me, the status, the love, the future, is now dust. He's telling us that our new life is built on nothing. The sight of the crushed metal was a final, crushing blow to her spirit. Jae-Hyun wasn't just watching, he was communicating. He was telling her that the bridge back to him was not just burned, but ground into powder. As Tendai began to curse and sweep the dust off the table in a fit of rage, Nyasha realized that the man she had run to was now literally standing in the ashes of the man she had left. The slow burn had reached the heart of their sanctuary, and the air was getting harder to breathe. The crushing weight of the diamond dust seemed to settle over the room like a shroud. Tendai paced the narrow strip of linoleum, his eyes darting toward the door every time a car passed on the street outside. The manic energy that had fueled his search for hidden money had soured into a cold, transactional panic. He stopped, not to comfort Nyasha, but to stare at the mangled platinum band as if it were a ticking bomb. He's going to kill us, Nyasha, Tendai said, his voice dropping into a flat, hollow tone. He isn't just watching anymore. That box, that's a marking. He's marked us. Nyasha sat motionless on the bed, her eyes fixed on the scattered remains of her engagement ring. He's marked me, Tendai. This was my ring. Tendai turned to her, and for a fleeting second, she hoped for a spark of the old devotion, the passionate first love that had promised to protect her from the world. Instead, his face hardened into a mask of pure survival. Exactly. It's you he wants. If we stay together, I'm just collateral damage. But if we split up, if I head south and you go toward the border, his people will follow the asset. They'll follow you. The air left Nyasha's lungs in a silent gasp. The betrayal was so casual, so logical, that it hurt more than Jae-Hyun's cold silence ever could. You want us to split up? Now. When I have nothing left. I can't protect you against a man who turns diamonds into dust, Nyasha. Be realistic. Tendai began throwing his few belongings back into his bag, his movements jagged and selfish. You told me you had the money. You told me we'd be set for life. I didn't sign up to be a ghost in a motel room waiting for a bullet. If there's no fortune, there's no point in both of us dying. Nyasha watched him, the veil finally falling away. In the sterile luxury of soul, she had romanticized Tendai as a symbol of freedom and raw emotion. She had convinced herself that Jae-Hyun was the monster because he was powerful and calculating. But as Tendai zipped his bag and avoided her gaze, she realized she had it backward. Jae-Hyun's love was a fortress, heavy, demanding, but absolute. Tendai's love was a seasonal flower that withered the moment the sun stopped shining. He hadn't come for her. He had come for the $10 million, and now that the gold had turned to lead, she was just an anchor dragging him down. "Go," she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. "If that's all I am to you, then go." Tendai didn't hesitate. He didn't even kiss her goodbye. He simply grabbed his bag and slipped out the door, leaving her alone in the shadows with the dust of her old life. In the silence that followed, Nyasha finally understood the depth of her ruin. She had traded a king's protection for a coward's greed, and now, the glacier was the only thing left in her world. The motel door didn't burst open with the force of a raid, it yielded with a quiet, mechanical click, as if the building itself recognized its true owner. Nyasha didn't scream. She simply stood in the center of the peeling linoleum, her breath hitching as the humid air of the room was displaced by a sudden, cooling draft. Seo Jae-Hyun walked inside alone, his silhouette cutting a sharp, tailored line against the squalor of the hallway. He wore no tactical gear, carried no visible weapon, and moved with a calm that was far more terrifying than violence. He didn't look at the disarray of the room or the open, empty safe. His gaze settled on Nyasha, eyes as dark and unblinking as a winter sea. For months, she had lived in fear of his men, his guns, and his reach, but standing face to face with his silence, she realized she had been afraid of the wrong thing. "You look tired, Nyasha," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man observing a predictable chemical reaction. Nyasha stepped back, her heel catching on a discarded silk dress. "Where is he? Where are your men?" "Outside," Jae-Hyun replied, stepping further into the room. He reached out and straightened a crooked lampshade, his fingers moving with the same devastating gentleness he had used when he first placed the diamond on her finger. "I didn't come here to kill a ghost. I came to see if the freedom you stole was worth the price you paid." The power dynamic shifted with the weight of a falling mountain. In Seoul, she had felt like a prisoner of his wealth, but here, in the vacuum of his presence, she realized that his rules had been the only thing keeping her whole. Without his shadow, she had been hunted by the sun, betrayed by her past, and reduced to a nameless girl in a nameless room. He stopped a few inches from her, his scent, expensive tobacco and cold iron, overwhelming the smell of the motel's decay. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, an unarmed man who owned every atom of the space they occupied. "Tendai is gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He left as soon as he realized the money was dead." "I know," Jae-Hyun said, his eyes tracing the path of a tear on her cheek. "I didn't stop him. A man who runs at the first sign of winter is not worth the effort of a chase." He tilted his head, his expression one of chilling, clinical curiosity. "Tell me, Nyasha. Now that the gold is gone and your lover has fled, who are you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Nyasha looked into his eyes and saw her own reflection, small, shattered, and utterly lost. She was terrified not of what he would do to her, but of the fact that he was the only person left in the world who even knew her name. The heavy door of the motel suite didn't close, instead, the hallway shadows lengthened as Han Soo-min stepped inside, trailing a man who looked like he had been dragged through the wreckage of his own soul. Tendai Mbeki was trembling, his hands cuffed behind him, his face a map of frantic, sweating desperation. He had been intercepted 2 blocks away, a coward trying to outrun a storm he didn't understand. Jae-Hyun didn't look at him. He remained focused on Nyasha, his expression a mask of cold clarity. At a subtle nod from Jae-Hyun, Soo-min placed a single, heavy leather suitcase on the scarred wooden table. She flipped the latches with a synchronized click-click that sounded like a firing squad. The lid fell back to reveal stacks of crisp, high-denomination bills, real currency, unflagged and untainted by the digital death Jae-Hyun had inflicted on the stolen bonds. It was more money than Tendai had seen in his entire life, a glowing altar of greed in the middle of a ruin. Tendai Becky, Jae-Hyun said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying authority. I am a man of contracts. You believe Nyasha's love came with a fortune. You were half correct. The fortune is here. It is real. It is yours. Tendai's eyes bulged, his gaze darting from the cash to Nyasha, and finally to the shadow of the man who held his life in his hands. The price, Jae-Hyun continued, stepping back to create a vacuum of choice, is simple. You take this case, you walk out that door, and you never speak her name again. You vanish from her life as if you were a ghost. Or, you stay. You stay with her, empty-handed, and face the consequences of stealing from me. Nyasha held her breath, her heart a fragile bird fluttering against the bars of her ribs. She looked at Tendai, searching for the first love, who had promised her the stars. She waited for him to scream his defiance, to throw the money back, to choose her. Tendai didn't even look at her. The greed that had replaced his soul transformed his face into something grotesque. He lunged for the suitcase, his fingers clawing at the bills as Soo-min released his cuffs. I'll go, he gasped, his voice high and frantic. I'll go. She was a mistake, man. She's all yours. I never wanted the trouble. He didn't offer a final glance. He didn't offer a word of apology. He grabbed the handle of the suitcase and stumbled out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing a hurried, pathetic rhythm as he fled into the night. Nyasha stood in the silence, the air in the room suddenly cold enough to shatter bone. She had traded a fortress for a man who could be bought for a suitcase of paper. She looked at Jae-Hyun, the man she had called a monster, and realized the only monster in the room was the one who had just walked out with the money. The echo of Tendai's frantic footsteps faded into the humid night, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the weight of the ocean. Nyasha stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the doorway where her freedom had just vanished with a suitcase and a coward's breath. The room, stripped of its illusions, felt smaller than ever, a squalid box of peeling wallpaper and broken promises. Seo Jae-Hyun didn't move toward her. He didn't offer the comfort of a reprimand or the heat of a vengeful hand. He simply adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his movements precise and elegant, a stark contrast to the wreckage surrounding them. The cold clarity in his eyes was no longer a threat, it was a mirror, reflecting the total, hollow sum of her choices. He was the dream you chose, Nyasha, Jae-Hyun said softly. His voice held no triumph, only a quiet, devastating finality. I gave you a kingdom and a name that commanded the respect of the city. You traded it for a man who priced your soul at the cost of a leather bag. Jae-Hyun, she whispered, the name catching in a throat tight with the realization of her ruin. She took a tentative step toward him, her hand trembling. I didn't know. You knew, he countered, his gaze stopping her in her tracks. You simply believed that loyalty was a burden and greed was a gift. You thought my protection was a cage, so I opened the door. I let you see the world as it truly is for those who have no one to watch their back. He turned toward the exit, his long black coat sweeping the floor. Soo-min stood at the threshold, her face as impassive as stone, already holding the door open for him. Wait, Nyasha gasped, the terror of the coming loneliness hitting her like a physical blow. Are you taking me back? Are you taking me to Seoul? Jae-Hyun paused, looking back over his shoulder. The moonlight from the hallway caught the edge of his silhouette, making him look like a god of lost things. I do not keep broken glass in my house, Nyasha. You are a ghost now, remember? You have your freedom. No bonds, no black card, and no shadow to hide in. He walked out, his footsteps steady and rhythmic, the sound of a man who had reclaimed his honor and left the trash behind. He didn't look back. He didn't leave a guard or a weapon. He left her with the one thing she had fought for, herself. Nyasha sank to the floor, her fingers brushing the diamond dust that still shimmered on the bedside table. In the distance, she heard the engine of his car roar to life and then fade into the night. She was alone in a foreign city, without a name, without a scent, and without the man she thought loved her. She had run away with a fortune, only to find that the only thing of value she ever possessed was the loyalty she had ground into the dust.